My husband gave the last place in the county storm shelter to his ex-wife while I stood outside holding our 3-week-old daughter. He did not misunderstand who was in danger. He looked directly at me through the reinforced glass, heard our baby crying against my chest, and pressed the button that locked the door. The tornado reached our neighborhood 11 minutes later. My name is Claire Bennett at the time. I was 34, a neonatal intensive care nurse in Wichita, Kansas, and so exhausted from new motherhood that I sometimes put clean bottles in the refrigerator and the milk in the cabinet. Our daughter Nora had been born 5 weeks early. She was healthy enough to come home, but she still tired easily while feeding and had trouble maintaining her body temperature. I had spent my career teaching frightened parents how to protect fragile infants. I never imagined I would have to protect my own child from a storm and from the man who had promised to put us first. My husband Ethan worked for Sedgwick County Emergency Management. His title was Community Preparedness Coordinator, which meant he organized drills, inspected public shelters, and gave television interviews whenever spring storms rolled across the plains. People trusted his voice because it stayed calm when sirens started. I had once trusted it for the same reason. Ethan had been married before. His ex-wife, Sabrina, lived 6 miles from us with her 13-year-old son, Owen. Owen was not Ethan's child, but Ethan had known him since he was 4 and remained attached to him after the divorce. I never objected to that. A child should not lose every adult who once loved him just because a marriage ended. The problem was never Owen. The problem was that Sabrina treated every inconvenience as an emergency, and Ethan treated every call from her as a command. If her water heater stopped working, Ethan left our dinner to inspect it. If her car made a noise, he drove across town before she could call a mechanic. When Owen forgot a science project, Ethan printed it at our house and delivered it to school. Each time I said the pattern made me uncomfortable, Ethan told me I was asking him to punish a child for an adult divorce. That was how he ended arguments. He turned a boundary into evidence that I lacked compassion. During my pregnancy, the pattern became harder to excuse. At 31 weeks, I developed contractions while Ethan was helping Sabrina move patio furniture before a thunderstorm. I called him 4 times. He arrived at the hospital nearly 2 hours later and asked why I had not called an ambulance. "Because I called my husband," I said. He kissed my forehead and told me not to make a frightening night worse by starting a fight. Nora was born at 35 weeks after my blood pressure spiked. Ethan was attentive in the hospital. He slept in a chair, learned how to measure her feedings, and cried when she wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb. For 3 weeks after we came home, I believed becoming a father had finally changed the order of his loyalties. Then the weather service began warning about a severe outbreak. Our house did not have a basement. Ethan had applied for a county rebate to install a residential safe room, but he kept delaying the contractor because he wanted a larger model. The closest public option was the reinforced shelter beneath the Northgate Community Center. It had 96 numbered places and opened whenever a tornado watch escalated. Because Nora was premature, Ethan arranged an accessibility reservation for 1 adult holding an infant. The shelter manager added my name to the manifest and told me to arrive early. The morning of the storm, the sky was bright and sticky. Ethan left at 6 to staff the Emergency Operations Center. Before he left, he placed Nora's diaper bag beside the front door and made me repeat the route to Northgate. "The watch will probably be upgraded around 4, he said. "Do not wait for the sirens. I'll meet you there if I can. Your place is C19. It's beside the medical cabinet, and if traffic is bad, show them this." He sent me a digital pass with my name, Nora's name, and a red medical priority stripe. Then he kissed her hair and said, "Daddy plans for everything." At 2:40 p.m., the watch became a particularly dangerous situation warning. Schools dismissed early. Grocery store parking lots filled with people buying bottled water they would not need and batteries they should have bought in March. I fed Nora, dressed her in a cotton sleeper, tucked 2 blankets around her carrier, and left. The first complication was a traffic signal that lost power. The second was a collision blocking the main entrance to Northgate. By the time I reached the shelter's side lot, rain was falling in coins and the wind had begun pushing shopping carts across the pavement. People were running toward the doors. A volunteer scanned my pass and waved me inside. The lobby smelled like wet coats and floor cleaner. Children cried whenever the weather radio sounded. I could see the steel shelter door at the end of the corridor. Then I saw Sabrina. She stood beside the check-in table in white jeans and heeled sandals, gripping Owen's shoulders. Neither of them was wet. Ethan stood with them in his county jacket, speaking urgently to the shelter manager. I felt relief before suspicion. Ethan had made it. Whatever history stood between us, I believed he would take Nora from my arms, lead us to C-19, and do his job. He came toward me instead and said, "Claire, I need you to listen without reacting." Those words had never introduced anything kind. Sabrina's neighborhood shelter had closed because of a gas leak. Northgate was already at its legal capacity. Owen had a place because the center had opened several youth overflow positions, but Sabrina did not. C-19 is one adult position, Ethan said. Nora doesn't count separately because you hold her. I need Sabrina to use it. I stared at him. Then where do Nora and I go? The operations center has an interior records room. I can take you there. That is 14 minutes away. 11 if the roads are clear. The weather radio announced a tornado warning for western Sedgwick County. The lobby changed instantly. Volunteers stopped reassuring people and began directing them through the steel door. "Put Sabrina in your truck and take her to the records room," I said. "Nora and I have the medical reservation." Sabrina started crying. "I can't be separated from Owen. He has panic attacks." Owen looked embarrassed rather than panicked. "Mom, I'll be okay." "No," she said, pulling him against her. "You don't understand what storms do to him." I looked at Ethan. "Our premature baby cannot regulate her temperature. We are already here. This is not a discussion." The shelter manager, Marlene, lowered her voice. "Mr. Bennett, the reservation belongs to your wife. I cannot transfer a medical space unless she agrees." Ethan displayed his county badge. "I'm activating emergency reassignment authority. Family unification reduces crowd risk. Put Sabrina in C-19. Marlene hesitated. That hesitation cost us the last 30 seconds in which someone might have stopped him. The outdoor sirens began. Ethan took Sabrina's elbow and moved her toward the door. I stepped in front of them. "If you do this, you are choosing her fear over your daughter's safety. I'm trying to keep everyone safe. No, you are sending me back into a tornado." He told Marlene to open the shelter. People surged forward. Sabrina and Owen passed through. I followed, but Ethan caught the strap of Nora's diaper bag and pulled me back hard enough to turn my shoulder. "The room is full," he said. "Then you go outside. Give me your position." Staff positions are not interchangeable. He was not staying in the shelter. He planned to drive back to the operations center in a county SUV rated for severe weather response. He had transportation, a radio, and access to reinforced buildings. I had a compact sedan in a parking lot filling with hail. Marlene said, "We have to seal now." I put my palm against the door. "Ethan, please. Not for me. For Nora." He looked at our daughter. His face changed, and for 1 second I believed he had returned to himself. Then Sabrina screamed his name from inside. Ethan pressed the locking control. The steel door closed between us. Through its narrow glass panel, I saw Sabrina in the place marked C-19. Owen stood beside her. Ethan said something I could not hear. I later learned the lobby camera recorded my final words clearly. "You know exactly who you locked out." The lights flickered. Ethan grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the exterior exit. "My truck is around the building," he said. "We can still make the operations center." We reached the glass lobby doors just as a branch struck them. The county SUV was not around the building. One of Ethan's deputies had taken it to transport an injured volunteer. My sedan sat across the lot under golf ball-sized hail. Ethan stared at his empty parking space. "Call them back," I said. He raised his radio. The channel was jammed with damage reports. A dispatcher announced a confirmed large tornado 7 miles southwest, moving northeast at 45 miles per hour. Northgate was in its path. Ethan told me we would shelter in the lobby restroom. I knew the building plans because he had brought them home during the inspection. The lobby had an exposed span roof and glass on 2 sides. The restrooms were made of metal studs, not reinforced block. They were not safe. I remembered a laundry service corridor behind the community theater. It led to a concrete utility tunnel connecting the older library annex. During a prenatal class held at Northgate, a custodian had complained that the tunnel flooded whenever it rained. Flooding was a danger. A concrete tunnel was still better than a glass lobby. "The service corridor," I said. Ethan shook his head. "That area isn't approved." "Neither is this lobby." Another woman appeared from the gym hallway holding the hand of an elderly man. Her name was Denise. She had been helping her father in the restroom when the shelter sealed. A teenage employee named Marcus ran from the theater carrying a first aid kit. There were 5 of us outside the protected room, including Nora. Ethan finally followed me. The service corridor was dark and ankle-deep in water. I wrapped Nora inside my shirt beneath my raincoat, keeping her face clear and my palm over the back of her head. Marcus used his phone flashlight. Denise's father moved slowly with a cane. The tornado siren stopped, not because the danger had passed, but because the power failed. The sound that replaced it did not resemble a train. It sounded like the entire building inhaling through broken teeth. We reached the utility door. It was locked. Ethan had a master keyring, but his hands shook so badly he dropped it into the water. Marcus found it. None of the keys turned. Inspection changed the cylinders last month, Ethan said. I wanted to scream at him. Instead, I asked Marcus whether the theater kept tools nearby. He returned with a short pry bar used for scenery. Ethan and Marcus forced the frame while Denise and I lowered her father beside the wall. The ceiling panels began lifting, air rushed down the corridor. Nora made one small sound against my chest, then became frighteningly still. The door opened 6 inches. We pushed through one at a time. Ethan went first, then Marcus helped Denise's father. I entered last because I refused to hand Nora to Ethan. The utility tunnel was narrow, wet, and completely dark. We moved 20 feet before the building above us exploded. Pressure slammed the door shut. Concrete dust rolled through the tunnel. Denise screamed. Pipes groaned overhead. I crouched over Nora and counted seconds because counting was what I did in emergencies. 10, 20, 30. My ears popped. Something heavy struck the other side of the door. Then the pressure dropped. Nora was not crying. I unzipped my coat and placed 2 fingers against the inside of her upper arm. Her pulse was fast but present. Dust coated my hair and eyelashes, but the cloth over her carrier had protected her airway. She opened her mouth, gathered breath, and released the angriest cry I had ever heard. Everyone in that tunnel began crying with her. We remained underground for 43 minutes. Water rose to our calves. Ethan tried twice to apologize, but I told him to use his radio. The concrete blocked most transmissions. Marcus eventually found an old maintenance hatch leading into the library boiler room. Firefighters reached us through the annex after the tornado passed. Northgate's lobby was gone. Cars had been rolled into the gym wall. My sedan was upside down 50 yards from where I had parked it. The reinforced shelter remained intact. Sabrina and Owen emerged without physical injuries. When Sabrina saw Nora in my arms, she covered her mouth. Ethan walked toward her before he walked toward me. It was only 3 steps, perhaps an old reflex, but I saw it, so did Marlene. I was taken to the hospital for cuts, dehydration, and possible hearing damage. Nora's temperature had dropped, and she stayed overnight for observation. Ethan sat beside her bassinet and kept saying we had all survived. Survival was the fact he used to make his decision smaller. You locked us out, I said. I thought I could drive you to the operations center. You did not have a vehicle. I didn't know it had been reassigned. You knew the warning had been issued. You knew the shelter was sealing. You knew C-19 belonged to your premature daughter. He rubbed both hands over his face. Owen freezes when he is frightened. Sabrina said he would run if she wasn't beside him. Owen told us he would be okay. She is his mother, and I am Nora's mother. You made me beg you to remember that she was your child. Ethan said the sentence I had heard throughout our marriage. You are stronger than Sabrina. That was when I understood the true structure of our relationship. He did not believe I needed less care. He believed my strength was available for him to spend. I asked a nurse to remove him from the room. The county opened an investigation the next morning. At first, Ethan described the event as a capacity misunderstanding complicated by rapidly changing transportation. He said I had voluntarily agreed to travel to the operations center. He said the shelter manager had approved a family unification exception. Marlene corrected him. Northgate had cameras in the lobby and electronic logs on the shelter door. The footage showed me refusing the transfer 3 times. It showed Ethan displaying his badge after Marlene objected. It showed him pulling me backward by Nora's diaper bag and pressing the lock while I stood outside. The audio captured Sabrina saying she could not be separated from Owen. It also captured Owen saying he would be fine. The county radio system provided the next piece. 8 minutes before I arrived, Ethan had been told his SUV was being used for medical transport. He had acknowledged the message. He knew he had no vehicle when he promised to take me elsewhere. That fact changed the investigation from a poor judgment call into something more deliberate. My attorney, Renee Foster, advised me not to discuss the case with Ethan. I moved with Nora into my sister's house while our roof was repaired. Ethan sent long messages describing his intentions. He wrote that he never believed the tornado would hit Northgate directly. He wrote that he knew I was capable in a crisis. He wrote that Sabrina had trauma related to storms. I already knew she did. Years earlier, Sabrina's younger brother, Luke, had died during a tornado while driving home from work. Ethan had been the person who told him it was safe to leave early. The storm changed direction and overturned Luke's truck. No investigation blamed Ethan, but Sabrina did during the worst months of their marriage. Ethan had spent years trying to repay a debt no authority had assigned him. I learned the rest from Owen's father. Sabrina had threatened to tell the county that Ethan falsified a shelter inspection 5 years earlier if he did not guarantee her a space at Northgate. The inspection issue was minor. Ethan had signed a form before a replacement ventilation fan was installed. The fan was installed 2 days later and no one was harmed, but Ethan had hidden the early signature from his supervisor. Sabrina kept a photograph of the form. On the morning of the storm, she texted him, "You owe my family. If Owen and I are turned away, everyone will know what you did." Ethan answered, "I will handle it. Claire has a reserved place." Sabrina wrote, "Then give me hers. She always handles everything." He did not object. The investigators recovered the messages from his county phone. When Renee showed them to me, the betrayal became quieter and more complete. Ethan had not made one impossible decision in a chaotic lobby. He had identified my safety as the resource he could trade before I arrived. Sabrina eventually admitted she knew I had a newborn, but claimed Ethan assured her I would be transported elsewhere. She was not a county employee and had no authority over the door. The harshest professional consequences belonged to him. Ethan was placed on administrative leave and then terminated for misuse of emergency authority, false statements during an official investigation, and violating shelter allocation policy. The district attorney charged him with official misconduct and reckless endangerment. He accepted a plea that included probation, community service, and a prohibition against holding a public safety position during the probation period. People online argued about whether the punishment was too severe because no one died. That argument appeared beneath photographs of Northgate's destroyed lobby. I stopped reading after a stranger wrote that a good mother would be grateful her baby survived. Gratitude and accountability can exist in the same body. I could be grateful for the utility tunnel and still refuse to pretend Ethan had led us there. I had remembered the tunnel. Marcus had found the tool. Marlene had told the truth. Ethan had followed after removing our safe option. I filed for divorce 6 weeks after the storm. Ethan asked for reconciliation counseling. I agreed to one session, not because I planned to stay, but because we would have to raise Nora in the same world. In that room, he said he had spent years trying to prove he was not responsible for Luke's death. "So you made yourself responsible for what happened to us?" I said. He cried. "I knew you would find a way. That is not love. That is gambling with someone because you trust her to survive the loss." The counselor asked Ethan what he would have done if Nora had died in the lobby. He could not answer. For the first time, silence did not protect him from the full size of his choice. Our custody agreement required supervised visits for the first 6 months, followed by a gradual schedule contingent on therapy and parenting classes. I did not try to remove him from Nora's life. I did insist that emergency decisions, medical care, and travel be documented. Ethan called the requirements humiliating. I told him humiliation was not the same as danger. Sabrina stopped contacting him after the investigation. Without his badge and his usefulness, the old debt apparently lost its urgency. Owen wrote me a letter. He said he had not known I was being left outside until the door closed. He wrote, "My mom said adults had a plan. I am sorry their plan was you. I kept the letter because it named the truth better than most legal documents did. Recovery was less dramatic than the tornado. Nora developed normally. My hearing returned. I went back to the NICU 3 months later and found that alarms made my heart race. I started therapy with a counselor who worked with disaster survivors. She taught me that trauma often attaches itself not only to the loudest moment, but to the last moment when safety was offered and withdrawn. For me, that moment was not the roof lifting from Northgate. It was Ethan's hand pressing the lock. The civil case forced me to describe the lobby repeatedly. Ethan's attorney asked why I did not arrive earlier. why I drove a compact car during a warning, and why I entered an unapproved utility corridor. Renee objected each time, but I still had to answer. That is one of the strangest parts of accountability. The person denied safety is often required to prove she exhausted every possible substitute for the safety already assigned to her. I explained the dead traffic signal, the crash at the entrance, and the timestamp showing I arrived before the shelter sealed. I explained that the utility corridor was a last resort after Ethan removed the approved one. The attorney asked whether my nursing experience helped me remain calm. Yes, I said. So Mr. Bennett had reason to believe you could manage an alternate shelter. My nursing license did not reinforce the lobby roof. The deposition ended early after that. Marlene's testimony mattered most. She had worked for the county for 26 years and could have protected her retirement by describing the transfer as mutual confusion. Instead, she produced the handwritten manifest showing C-19 beside my name. She testified that Ethan used his badge after she refused the reassignment, and that she feared losing her job if she challenged him while people were rushing the door. I watched a rule become optional because the person breaking it had a higher title, she said. I will regret that for the rest of my life. Afterward, I told her the responsibility belonged to Ethan. She answered that responsibility was not a pie with only one slice. Ethan owned the decision. She still wanted to own the moment she went silent. Her honesty helped me stop dividing people into heroes and villains. Good people can hesitate. Frightened people can still return later and tell the truth. The difference is what they do once the danger has passed. Marcus, the teenage theater employee, testified too. He had been 17 during the storm. His mother worried the legal process would damage his college applications. Instead, a local engineering firm offered him an internship after hearing how he remembered the pry bar and helped move Denise's father. He later studied structural engineering. Denise's father, Mr. Cooper, died the following winter from an unrelated illness. At his funeral, Denise introduced me as the woman who got him through the tunnel. I corrected her and said we had all gotten one another through. Mr. Cooper had been the person who kept repeating the Lord's Prayer in the dark, giving the rest of us a rhythm when the building shook. Those relationships became part of the recovery Ethan never saw. He imagined consequences as things taken from him: job, reputation, marriage, unrestricted parenting. I experienced recovery as things built among people who had no reason to protect his story. The civil claim settled without trial. The county paid for medical expenses, temporary housing, and Nora's follow-up care. Ethan contributed through his personal liability coverage. I set aside most of Nora's portion in a protected account. The money felt uncomfortable, as if accepting it placed a price on the glass door. Renee reminded me compensation is not a purchase of silence unless I agree to silence. I did not. I spoke to local nursing students about disaster planning for medically fragile infants. I learned that public shelters often write policies around ideal arrivals: early, calm, fully informed, carrying every supply. Real families arrive through traffic, power failures, feeding schedules, and fear. A reservation must survive those complications, or it is only a suggestion. Ethan attended one of the public hearings. He sat in the back without contacting me. When the county attorney played the lobby video, he lowered his head before the image reached the moment he pressed the lock. For a long time I wondered whether that gesture meant remorse. Eventually I stopped translating his body for him. During supervised visits, he once tried to take Nora to Sabrina's neighborhood because Owen had a birthday party. The supervisor refused because the location was not approved. Ethan complained that everyone still treated Sabrina like a threat. I answered through the parenting app that Sabrina was not the custody issue. His willingness to erase rules around her was. That distinction became the center of our co-parenting. I did not demand that he hate Sabrina, deny his history, or stop caring about Owen. I demanded that his feelings never again create exceptions that removed Nora's protection. For the first year, he heard that as punishment. In the second, he began following it without argument. The county rebuilt the community center. The new shelter has 140 places, an exterior backup generator, and a policy requiring two-person approval for any reassignment. Marlene invited me to speak at the reopening. I almost refused because I did not want my worst day turned into a motivational story. Then she told me the county had named the utility corridor as a secondary refuge and stocked it with lights, blankets, and emergency tools. I attended with Nora on my hip. She was 14 months old and fascinated by the microphone. I did not speak about destiny or forgiveness. I spoke about systems. A safety plan is only real if the person with authority cannot quietly decide that someone else matters more, I said. Compassion does not require sacrificing the person least likely to complain. Strength is not consent. Afterward, a young mother asked whether I still feared storms. I told her yes. Courage had not erased the fear. It had simply given me procedures that belonged to me: shoes beside the bed, a charged weather radio, supplies in the car, and a safe room in the new house I bought with my sister's help. The safe room has 6 places. That was intentional. I never wanted a child standing in my hallway to hear that safety had reached capacity. Ethan completed probation and found work selling commercial generators. He sees Nora regularly now. He follows the custody plan, and he has become more careful about promises. I do not know whether that change comes from remorse, consequence, or the knowledge that every decision can be documented. The reason is no longer mine to manage. On Nora's 2nd birthday, a storm watch was issued. Ethan arrived early for his visit and asked whether I wanted him to stay until it passed. I said no. He looked toward the safe room door, then back at me. I understand, he said. I believed that he understood the boundary, which was enough. Understanding did not reopen our marriage. It did not restore the moment behind the glass. Some lessons arrive after the future they might have saved. The storm moved north of us that night. Nora slept through the thunder with one hand wrapped around my finger. I sat beside her for a long time, listening to the rain strike a roof I owned and a door no one else controlled. People often say disasters reveal who we are. I think they reveal what our ordinary habits have been building. Ethan did not become a man who chose Sabrina in the lobby. He had practiced choosing her in hundreds of smaller rooms. And I had practiced surviving those choices because I mistook endurance for peace. The tornado only made the pattern impossible to ignore. I used to think the worst sound of that day was the building coming apart above us. It was not. The worst sound was the shelter lock engaging while my husband stood on the other side of my daughter's name. The best sound came a minute later in the dark tunnel, when Nora filled her lungs and cried. That cry told me she was alive. It also told me something I would spend the next year learning to believe. Survival was not a favor Ethan had correctly expected from me. It was the life Nora and I fought for after he gave our safety away.